So, this lecture is on film number 2, Fire in Paradise. So, just what are the consequences of the climate crisis? Note that I say are rather than will be, as the consequences of the crisis are now, sadly, already here, and more are arriving every day. The fact is that there are many, many consequences appearing across the planet. The documentary Fire in Paradise looks at just one: wildfires caused by drought conditions exacerbated by the climate crisis. In fact, it looks at just one such fire. Unlike many of the documentaries that we are watching in this class, this film does not focus on the climate crisis in the sense that it does not survey the problem or offer solutions. To the contrary, while Fire in Paradise does spend some time addressing the climate crisis, the focus is really on the horrific consequences for one Northern California town. Consequently, if you didn't watch this little blurb of mine, you might wonder why I even included this film in a course on the climate crisis. Fair enough. So, when the climate crisis entered the public imagination in the closing quarter of the 20th century, we generally referred to it as, quote, global warming, and saw the potential consequences in these terms. In other words, the big concern was sea level rise. As nearly half of the world's population lives on or near the coast, sea level rise was rightfully an issue of, pretty great concern. However, for the other half of the world's population, it was often seen as an issue of less immediate concern. Moreover, it seemed rather far off to many Americans, not only in the sense of being far off in time, decades from now, but also not much of an issue close to home in the United States. The countries that would suffer, like the island nations of the Maldives in South Asia, where, the average ground elevation is just 1.5 meters, seem pretty far away. And since scientists were predicting a gradual increase in sea level rise, it seemed like the wealthy countries like the United States would have decades to respond, perhaps by building levees or other, new infrastructure. We now know, however, that not only will climate change bring about many, many more changes than just sea level rise, but that they will come far faster than we imagine and hit closer to home, regardless of where your home is on the planet. Since this course is taking place in California, I thought it appropriate to consider the impact that it is having here in California now. 4 of the 5 largest wildfires in California history happened in the past decade. That's the teens. One of them, the Thomas Fire, happened here in Santa Barbara just a few years ago. At the time, it was the largest wildfire in California's recorded history, though it has now been surpassed. We could approach this from a statistical, scientific perspective. Doing so would reveal that we're in the midst of an ever-worsening situation with respect to wildfires in California. But what does this mean in human terms? As we, are approaching the climate crisis from a human cultural perspective in this class, this is really a really important question. The documentary Fire in Paradise takes it up. As it turns out, I can also address this question personally, as the Thomas Fire came to within almost a mile of my house. At one point, it was spreading at 1 acre per second, which is absolutely astonishing. The smoke was so bad that I needed to leave town, as I was very concerned for my, young daughter and her lungs, as she was just a toddler at the time. It was an emotional moment when we left, as it was not at all clear that we would have a home to which to return. Fortunately, our home, as well as the city of Santa Barbara, was spared. Unfortunately, many people in nearby Montecito also thought that the danger was over, only to be caught in mud and debris flows a month later. This is because vegetation had been burned by the Thomas Fire, so there was no, sufficient plant and root structure to deal with an extraordinary unusual weather event when 1/2 an inch of rain fell in a 5-minute period. Because this downpour downpour took place at 3 a.m., many people were not even aware that was happening. In some places, the debris flow was over 15 feet in height, bringing entire boulders with it. Moving at a speed of up to 20 miles an hour, it was just impossible to outrun. Over 20 people were killed. In some places, the debris flow continued all the way down to the ocean, crossing a major freeway, which is Route 101 in the process. Because it deposited nearly 12 feet of mud, water, and debris on the freeway in some places, it was closed for nearly 2 weeks. Having burned over 280,000 acres, there had never been anything like the Thomas Fire in recorded history in California. However, in just half a year, it would be surpassed by the Ranch Fire, which burned nearly 500,000 acres. Astonishingly, the Ranch Fire would be surpassed the same year by the Camp Fire, which is the subject of the PBS documentary Fire in Paradise. Surpassed not in the sense of burning more acres, which it didn't, but rather by being more destructive. In fact, it was the most expensive natural disaster in 2018, not only in California, but worldwide. In addition, as it killed more people, it was also the deadliest wildfire in California history. The documentary Fire in Paradise puts a human face on the climate crisis, which will impact all sorts of people across the planet in all sorts of ways. Although some people, and that's climate change deniers, would like us to believe that the climate crisis is just scientists wildly speculating on the future, incidents like the Camp Fire make clear that the climate crisis is all too real, and that it and the future is here, now, even in sunny California. Even in incredibly wealthy parts of California, like Montecito, where scores of celebrities have homes. I'm curious to hear what you think, as well as how you feel about all this and the documentary, Fire in Paradise. As something of a postscript, when I put together the first draft of this section during the first week of the January in 2020, wildfires were burning across Australia. At that time, over 12 million acres had been burned. By the time it was over, these fires had burned an astonishing 46 million acres in Australia. Of the 20 largest wildfires in California history, 15 took place in the 21st century. The Australia fires were 15 times larger than all those 15 wildfires combined. Let me repeat that, 15 times larger than the 15 largest wildfires in California history combined. Class discussion of Fire in Paradise. Well, let's note at the beginning what we always do, which is, if you read this in italics, that some things have been paraphrased, have not been paraphrased or altered, although I do correct the occasional typo, and because of space concerns, often just part of the comment is reproduced here along with my corresponding comment. In working through these, I will first quote a student's observation, followed by my thoughts. So, first comment. Fire in Paradise is one of the most scary and heartbreaking things that I have ever seen. I honestly wanted to stop watching the film during many scenes because I felt overwhelmed, as if I were experiencing the fire along with everyone else. End of the comment. On the syllabus for our course, I put a trigger warning to alert people to the fact that this can be an emotionally overwhelming documentary, especially if you have experienced a fire of any type, but really especially a wildfire, which is an increasingly number of Californians now have experienced it. Although it is a well-put-together documentary, the emotional force comes in part from the striking images, but mostly from hearing firsthand from people who experienced the campfire. Because we tend to think of the impact of climate crisis not being far off, either in a far-off place or a far-off future, it was particularly unnerving to see it right here in California, right now. So, second comment. When watching the film Fire in Paradise, I started having heavy flashbacks to where I was and what I was doing when the Paradise Fire happened. Where I'm from, my hometown, is only 2 hours away from Paradise, but we were still heavily affected by that fire. I can remember feeling the same panic that the people in the film were feeling. I can remember all of us in our town so nervous when thoughts began to pop up, such as, are the ashes coming down going to land here? Is another fire going to happen here? If Sacramento is being altered by the potential harm of the ashes and the smoke, do we have to worry too? I can remember all the students and the teachers and the parents protesting from our school district to cancel school because the air was so terrible. End of the quote. The documentary Fire in Paradise takes us to the epicenter of the campfire. However, it's important to realize that a fire like this can have far-reaching, literally, impact, often hundreds of miles away. Recall that I noted in 2017 the Thomas Fire near Santa Barbara was the largest wildfire in recorded history up until then, at 280,000 acres. In late summer and early fall of 2020, two more wildfires surpassed this, the Creek Fire, which burned 380,000 acres, and the North Campus Fire, which burned 319,000 acres. The Creek Fire and the North Campus Fire were respectively over 20 and 150 miles from San Francisco. However, San Francisco became an extraordinarily eerie place at the time, as even in the middle of the day, the skies were a dark red color, kind of like twilight, but a very odd twilight that filled the entire sky. This was because the air was filled with tiny microscopic particles. Unfortunately, the air was so saturated with these particles that it became unhealthy to breathe. The Northern California fires in August of 2020 impacted the air quality of nearly 7.8 million residents in the San Francisco Bay Area alone, and millions more outside of the Bay Area were impacted, including places as far away as Reno, Nevada. Wildfires release nitrogen oxide and hydrocarbons that contribute to elevated ozone levels, which can worsen symptoms of bronchitis, emphysema and asthma, which can also increase the likelihood of cardiac arrest. A study published in the Journal of the American Heart Association found that exposure to heavy smoke during the recent California wildfires raised the risk of out-of-hospital cardiac arrests by up to 70%. One can imagine making a documentary about the impact of California wildfires, the impact that they have hundreds of miles away. I'm not sure that it would be as striking as Fire in Paradise, but I imagine it would be nonetheless heartbreaking. Incidentally, quite a few students in the class are from the area surrounding the Paradise Fire. Here is another example of how it impacted someone. I had avoided watching the Fire in Paradise film for so long because I knew that it would be completely heartbreaking. I live about an hour away from Paradise and remember how terrified everyone was here, even though we were so far from the flames. I can't even imagine the emotions that residents of Paradise and the surrounding communities must have experienced. My high school was shut down for a week and a half. Not only because of the downpour of ashes, made it for unhealthy air quality, but also because our campus was an evacuation site. Close quote. When the Thomas Fire was still some distance from the city of Santa Barbara, I woke to an eerie sight as the ground was blanketed in a white-gray color and the air was filled with flakes dropping to the ground. It was almost like snow. But of course it wasn't. Ashes from a fire many miles away, were falling on our ground. At that time, I didn't know about the above facts regarding inhalation of particulates caused by wildfires. But having made my living as a furniture maker for many years, I knew the really scary part was not what you could see, but what you could only smell, as the air was filled with tiny microscopic particles that were being absorbed into people's lungs. which is why my family, like so many others during the wildfire, evacuated, even if they lived some distance from the fire. During my first year at UCSB, I became friends with someone who lived in Paradise. I remember him telling me, oh, this is another comment, how beautiful Paradise was and how I had to go for a visit. But soon his hometown was engulfed in flames, and his whole family lost everything. He had to move back to school with his family to regroup and restart their lives. I was heartbroken when I heard about the fire, but after watching the documentary Fire in Paradise, my heart was completely crushed. Because Climate Crisis 101 is such a large class, it contains many students who have either personally experienced the consequences of climate change, like wildfires, or know people that have. While the documentary focused on the fast-moving fire itself, we sometimes forget that an event like this will have consequences not only many miles away from wildfires themselves, as I just noted, but also for many years to come. Not only will students have to leave school to go back home, but people will lose jobs in businesses that will never reopen. Homes will never be rebuilt sometimes because of an adequate lack of insurance, and people will continue to directly suffer the bodily consequences, such as from lung damage from smoke inhalation during the fire for many years. If this wasn't all bad enough, there are a range of seemingly obscure issues that are nonetheless quite a problem. As the New York Times noted, the runoff from burned homes can put harmful chemicals such as benzene into groundwater and local reserves. The Environmental Protection Agency classifies water from benzene levels above 500 parts with benzene levels above 500 parts per billion as hazardous. Some samples in Paradise after the fire were found to have 2,000 parts per billion, 4 times as much. In Sonoma County, after the Wine County fires these samples had some 4,000 parts per billion. Remember, 500 is the limit. Yeah, next quote. Moving at 80 football fields emitted and eventually covering the size of Chicago, this incident that should have not been as big a deal as it was became seared in the memories of the 50,000 people who managed to escape. But also ended up being the last memory for 85 people. No matter how crazy the statistics of the fire are, nothing was more impactful to me than seeing the vigor of the fire contrasted to how serene Paradise once was. Not only will the altered climate worldwide affect the Earth's ecosystems from a scientific point of view, which they will, but it has a sentiment attached to it, as it kills all kinds of species, including humans. But not just humans in general. Our parents, grandparents, brothers, sisters, neighbors. It is happening, and it needs to be addressed. Yeah, well put. Statistics like the fact that the campfire was the size of the city of Chicago can certainly be instrumental. However, as this person notes, quote, nothing was more impactful than seeing the vigor of the fire contrasted to how serene Paradise once was, close quote. The fire did not impact a certain number of acres, but rather a real place, which happened to have been a strikingly beautiful one, inhabited by real people. And let's not forget that a range of additional beings that were also there lost their lives. A whole other documentary, which I imagine would be very moving, could have focused on the animals and birds living in the area that also lost their homes and lives. This comment rather succinctly draws attention to the human focus of Climate Crisis 101. Yes, as the comment wonderfully noted, we can approach the climate crisis from a scientific point of view, but it has a sentiment attached to it, as it kills all sorts of species, including humans, but not just humans in general, our grandparents, parents, brothers, sisters, neighbors, close quote. Not only is the climate crisis being brought about by human action, our actions are impacting all the beings on the planet, including the human ones. While we might find this fact useful to know, actually seeing the faces of people suffering because of our action brings the issue home. The following observation approaches the same issue. So, open quote. This family is difficult to watch. The film is difficult to watch, largely because of how human it is. In my other ecology classes, we've often been told the cold, hard facts and numbers. While the statistics are convincing and concerning, they never made me feel as distraught as the personal account. On-site footage and recorded phone calls presented in this film. End of the quote. As I continue to note throughout Climate Crisis 101, I have enormous respect for my friends and colleagues in the sciences, especially and in some ways, including and especially in some ways, especially those offering courses that translate the climate crisis into cold, hard facts and numbers. However, as I will also continually note through Climate Crisis 101, even if you are not a scientist, there are definitely things that you can do to make an intervention in the climate crisis. Communication is a great example. Let me take this opportunity to throw in a plug, just in case you're looking for a way to help mitigate the climate crisis, or in case you're looking for a major. We have an excellent department of film and media studies here at UCSB. It's also worth noting that now that the film industry has been democratized thanks to the internet and technology advances in the last few decades, I'm especially thinking of the fact that smartphones now have excellent video cameras. Anyone can be an influencer thanks to YouTube, TikTok, and other platforms. Indeed, I can imagine going to a place like Paradise after the fire and just recording a series of personal accounts with a smartphone, as well as filming the damage caused by the fire. With the right mix of creativity and careful editing, I would imagine that this would make for a striking series of videos on YouTube or TikTok. Finally, regarding this comment, it's worth noting that Climate Crisis 101, even though it takes a human approach to this issue, is for more than just majors in the humanities and social sciences. In that sense, think of our approach as being complementary to the natural sciences. As this person rightly notes, quote, statistics are convincing and concerning, close quote, but they are not the same as personal accounts, on-site footage, and recorded phone calls. In other words, one of the goals of Climate Crisis 101 is to not only understand the problem, but to feel it as well. The following two comments made this point especially well, I thought. Open quote. As an environmental studies major and a climate activist, I have watched many films about the climate crisis and the impacts that it has and will continue to cause if action is not immediately taken. However, I do not recall any film that has ever evoked the same level of emotion that Fire in Paradise did. I found myself reaching for a box of tissues more than once. Close quote. The following statement made a similar point, and open quote again. In Ken's YouTube video that gives an introduction to this documentary, he explains that because the film isn't a scholarly film, we may wonder why it's even being required. But I wasn't questioning this at all. It's easy to see why this would be such an important film to broadcast. In fact, I sometimes think that films like these are more important to watch than films that spew a bunch of facts. This documentary has made me so engrossed and invested that I even shed a few tears at some point. I feel like I just went through such a visceral, cathartic experience after watching the utter devastation that this wildfire created. Looking at environmental issues from a humanistic perspective rather than a scientific one allows people to form emotions about climate issues rather than simply being exposed to facts. And that's the end of that quote. One of the most remarkable things about human beings is that we can experience empathy with other beings, which is, incidentally, not limited to human beings. We can feel empathy, for example, animals as well. According to the Encyclopedia of Social Psychology, and I quote here, empathy is often defined as understanding another person's experience by imagining oneself in that person's situation. One understands the other person's experience as if it were being experienced by the self, but without the actual self experiencing it. That's a close quote. One of the remarkable things about communication is that we can activate feelings of empathy by way of films and all sorts of media. As this comment noted, quote, I feel like I just went through such a visceral cathartic experience after watching the utter devastation that this wildfire created. This is, of course, just a feeling rather than this individual's own personal experience. However, because of the gift of empathy, it feels rather like we had actually experienced it ourselves, as this person aptly notes. As much as I respect the natural sciences, empathy is generally not their stock and trade. However, if we hope to convince people that we need to mitigate the climate crisis, engaging their emotions can be a very important approach. The difficulty is that feeling emotions of this sort can sometimes be, a little overwhelming. This is, of course, why Climate Crisis 101 can be especially depressing in the first 3 weeks. Fortunately, empathy works both ways, as we will be meeting a range of individuals by way of the course documentaries and readings in the second two-thirds of Climate Crisis 101, who are doing absolutely amazing things to mitigate the climate crisis. With any luck, meeting them will help bring about good, positive feelings. So the next comment. In 2019, Greta Thunberg delivered a powerful speech asking people to act as if their house is on fire. But this is no longer an if. Our house is literally on fire. The climate crisis is a daunting task and can at times make us feel like sitting ducks, as people did in the film, waiting for the climate change or a fire to wipe us out. However, I have hope for our future. I believe that my generation will be able to make the cultural change necessary to finally put the fire that has engulfed our home we call planet Earth out. Close quote. It is an altogether remarkable fact that Greta Thunberg, who was in many ways just an average high school student, forever changed the climate change discussion. Perhaps because shouting fire in a crowded theater is a popular analogy for speech or actions made for the principal purpose of creating panic, for a long time most climate activists shied away from making statements that would allow them to be perceived as climate alarmists, which is in fact the term the climate change deniers use for climate activists. This was a clever move on the part of deniers, and make no mistake, they can be very clever, as it discouraged people speaking about the climate crisis in alarmist terms. However, in her January 2019 speech to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Thunberg reframed the conversation by boldly claiming, quote, our house is on fire. In other words, this is an emergency and we need to act immediately. Lives are at stake. Astonishingly, as the above student noted, for some people, their houses have literally been burned to the ground by the climate crisis. There is a potential danger in this approach, as people can become petrified, and by that I mean stunned into inaction by fear, or made to feel that, in the words of this comment, quote, like sitting ducks waiting for climate change or a fire to wipe us out, close quote. However, this person resists this feeling to instead declare that I have hope for the future. This strikes me as a perfect balance, on the one hand, taking the issue most seriously, even to the point of being alarmed, but on the other hand, not being petrified by the fear, but rather having hope. I've tried to balance the material in Climate Crisis 101 in the hope that most people will feel this way by the end of the term. If you do not feel this way right now, I wouldn't worry, as we haven't gotten to the solutions yet. Finally, this comment notes the quote, I believe that my generation will be able to make the cultural change to finally put the fire out that has engulfed our home we call planet Earth. End quote. As I explained in the chapter of Climate Crisis 101 on climate and generation, I believe that my students and their generation will solve this problem. It is frustrating that it has landed on your shoulders, as my generation and the one after it has done very little to mitigate the climate crisis. This is unfair. You do deserve an apology. The next comment. Having taken English 22 already, I watched the second film and found it to be effective because of the people that tell the story. The fact that the film showcased the story of young kids around our age made me think about what the situation may have been like if it happened to me and those around me. Seeing people who live a very similar life to yours, and then their life got turned around completely upside down, was very disheartening, but also very close to home. When I watched the other films, such as the one starring Leonardo DiCaprio or Al Gore, although also powerful, I did not get the same feeling. This film showed that this type of disaster can happen to anyone at any moment and change your entire life forever. End of the quote. Although most people watched the documentary Fire in Paradise, students who had already watched this film were asked to instead watch the story of California's Camp Fire, as told by Paradise High school students. It is an August 2020 documentary produced by the New Yorker magazine. As far as I'm concerned, Fire in Paradise is the better, more effective of the two films. However, I offered up this option as it, to borrow words from this comment, quote, showcased the story of young kids around our age, which made me think about what the situation might have been like if it had happened to me and those around me, close quote. This, of course, turns back on the question of empathy. While plenty of people in our class experienced deep empathy for people in the Fire in Paradise documentary, many were literally brought to tears. We don't always feel the same empathy for everyone. This is simply human nature. Consequently, it can sometimes be difficult for a college student to emotionally connect with the famous and wealthy person in his 40s, like Leonardo DiCaprio, or Al Gore, another wealthy white guy who is old enough to be DiCaprio's father. Consequently, seeing how people just like you, in this case high school students in California, were impacted by the wildfire in Paradise can sometimes be very effective. This turns us back on the issue of communication, as certain approaches may work best for certain audiences. For example, taking an alternative approach by focusing on the loss of houses, businesses, and property may not elicit a great deal of empathy from high school students. However, if you knew that your audience were relatively wealthy homeowners, this might be an effective approach. As far as I'm concerned, when it comes to communicating the severity of the climate crisis, and by that I mean, prompting people to action, a broad range of approaches should be explored. So, next comment. Even though my dad is a firefighter and talks about how draining and dangerous wildfires can be, and how he has lost friends trying to help in situations like this. And even though he talks about his experiences, I don't think I've ever fully understood how detrimental wildfires truly are. I've heard the stories, I've watched the news, but this documentary really opened my eyes to how climate change is such a large, dangerous influence, and how it has made fires so much worse. End of the quote. This comment addresses an important point, which not only applies to California wildfires, but to a range of other consequences of the climate crisis. As the recent wildfires that we have been considering, are they being caused by anthropogenic climate change? No, they are not, in the sense that this area of North America has a long history of wildfires that predate climate change and even human beings arriving here thousands of years ago. However, we are now having more and more severe wildfires than we ever had before. As this person very succinctly notes, quote, "The climate crisis has made fires so much worse," close quote. That's correct. Incidentally, the same can be said of other consequences of the climate crisis, such as hurricanes. Hurricanes have probably been around for nearly as long as the Atlantic Ocean. However, we are now having more and more severe hurricanes than ever before in human history. Climate change is making wildfires more common and more severe because of a combination of rising heat, longer droughts, and powerful winds. In terms of longer droughts, it used to be the case that California would begin its rainy season around October. When I first arrived in Santa Barbara in 2006, this was generally the case. These were very welcome occurrences as they would wet everything down, greatly reducing the chance of a wildfire. However, because of climate change, the seasonal rains do not come until November or even December, if they come at all. Consequently, not only does the dry season exist for a longer period, everything dries out more as the months go on, which significantly raises the risk of wildfire. The Camp Fire that destroyed the town of Paradise occurred in November. The Thomas Fire that threatened Santa Barbara happened in December. If seasonal rains had come in October of either of these years, neither fire may have happened. Because the climate has changed, people have begun to refer to California's current situation of more and more severe wildfires as the, quote, new normal. After the Thomas Fire near Santa Barbara, the governor of the state at the time, Jerry Brown, noted that, quote, "This is the new normal, and this could be something that happens every year or every few years. It happens to some degrees. It just is more intense, more widespread, and we're ready to have firefighters at Christmas," close quote. However, as Philip Duffy, a climate scientist who was president of the Woodwell Climate Research Center, what he noted in the New York Times was, quote, "People are always asking, is this the new normal?" He said. "I always say, no, it's going to get worse." The next quote, "Documentaries like these should be played in science classes across the country because they could further influence the generation who will continue to take action against worsening climate change." However, big corporations and businesses are the ones who hold wads of power, and most of them aren't doing anything to slow down or to slow or end their impact on the world and its climate. Big names, brands, companies tend not to be held accountable for their action, whether it's something giant like starting a devastating wildfire, or just admitting that they need to alter production and come up with a new sustainable model that could potentially make a world of difference in the world we live in. Close quote. So I wholeheartedly agree that documentaries like this should be played in classrooms across the country. However, I would argue that to be most effective and elicit the most empathy, such films should be tailor-made to each area. I happen to have been a visiting professor at Princeton University when Superstorm Sandy hit. Although the situation was entirely different, as the problem was principally gale winds and a massive storm surge that flooded, among other places, some of Manhattan's subways, the death toll was far greater than the Camp Fire, believe it or not, as 233 people across 8 countries from the Caribbean to Canada were killed by Superstorm Sandy. In other words, as the climate crisis is now hitting close to home, regardless of where you live, I think that everyone should know how it is impacting their nearby friends and neighbors. Regarding the observation that, quote, "big names, brands, companies need to be held accountable for their actions," close quote, the following comment squarely takes on this issue. So, next comment. there is a short list of people who could be considered directly responsible for the loss of life in paradise. The higher-ups at ExxonMobil, who created their own studies and knew for a fact and continued to use fossil fuels that was going to be dangerous and said nothing. That was 40 years ago, by the way. The Koch brothers and every other right-wing think tank funded by oil money that's lied to the American public and the world. Many of these people are still around today, living comfortable and often luxurious lives. What these CEOs and politicians have done to my generation and many that will come after ours goes far beyond neglect or selfish. It's criminal. These people are criminals. Their mindless pursuit of infinite growth lays the fate of every town like paradise squarely at their feet. One can only hope for a day when these people could be tried for crimes against humanity, a sort of climate Nuremberg trials. But sadly, that day likely won't be coming anytime soon. All we can do is ensure towns like Paradise are never forgotten and keep fighting for a better world. Close quote. Yeah, what a powerful comment. In one sense, the campfire that destroyed Paradise, California, was caused by electrical transmission lines owned and operated by Pacific Gas and Electric, that's PG&E, located in the Polga area. However, in another sense, it could be argued that the cause of the campfire may have indeed been anthropogenic climate change. In the past 140 years, the average temperature on Earth has increased by roughly 2%. However, in California, the increase was 3%. As the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, and that's CAL FIRE, notes, quote, the length of fire season is estimated to have increased by 75 days across parts of California, such as the Sierras. As CAL FIRE further notes, this seems to correspond with an increase in the extent of forest fires across the state. In other words, if the fire season ended in October rains in 2018, as it has traditionally, the PSE&G transmission lines may not have sparked the fire on the morning of November 8th of that year. If this is indeed the case, who then should we blame for the problem? The comment boldly suggests that ExxonMobil should be partly held responsible for the campfire because they created their own studies and knew for a fact and then continued to use the continued fossil fuel use was going to be disastrous and said nothing. So what's the story here? Well, as Inside Climate News noted back in a milestone 2015 article, back in 1977, the senior scientists with the Exxon Corporation delivered a talk to the corporate headquarters where they noted that, quote, there is a general scientific agreement that the most likely manner in which mankind has influenced the global climate change is through carbon dioxide released from the burning of fossil fuels. Exxon quickly responded by commissioning an ambitious program that included both empirical CO2 sampling and rigorous climate modeling. Then, toward the end of the 1980s, Exxon curtailed its carbon dioxide research. In the decades that follow, Exxon worked instead at the forefront of climate denial. It put its muscle behind efforts to manufacture doubt about the reality of global warming, and that scientists had actually confirmed. It lobbied to block federal and international action to control greenhouse gas emissions. It helped to erect a vast edifice of misinformation that stands to this day. So it can and certainly has been argued that organizations like ExxonMobil and the Koch brothers, also mentioned in this comment, of course, could have intervened in anthropogenic climate change just as it was really beginning to take off 40 years ago. In 1977, CO2 in the atmosphere was 330 parts per million. It's now nearly 420 today, an increase of almost 20%. Instead, they not only concealed the findings of their own scientists, but vehemently denied it. Indeed, they helped inaugurate an era of climate change denial. This is why the student is so outraged. And I quote the student again: "What these CEOs and politicians have done to my generation and many that come after goes far beyond neglect or selfish. It's criminal. These people are criminal. Their mindless pursuit of infinite growth lays the fate of every town like Paradise squarely at their feet." Yeah, I don't know what more I could say here. I'll end with this, consequently end with this blunt and very powerful statement. Okay, thank you.